There's a port in Sri Lanka that sits almost empty. It cost $1 billion to build. China paid for most of it, and when Sri Lanka couldn't pay China back, they handed over the port itself for 99 years. I'm Ethan, and today we're talking about one of the strangest financial patterns in modern geopolitics. This isn't a story about generosity gone wrong. It's not even really about debt. It's about what happens when infrastructure becomes currency and money becomes a tool for something much bigger than profit. China has lent over $1 trillion to countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America in the last 2 decades. A lot of those countries are struggling to pay it back. Some have already defaulted. And yet China keeps lending, which raises an obvious question. Why would you keep giving money to people who can't repay you? The answer isn't what you think, and it reveals one of the most quietly ambitious geopolitical strategies of the 21st century. Let's start with what this actually looks like on the ground. In 2013, China launched something called the Belt and Road Initiative. The name is deliberately grand. It references ancient trade routes, Silk Roads, maritime passages. The idea was to rebuild global infrastructure, connecting China to Europe, Africa, and beyond through ports, railways, highways, and pipelines. But here's the mechanism. China doesn't just invest in these projects. They lend money to foreign governments who then hired Chinese companies to build the infrastructure. The loans are big. The interest rates are higher than what you get from the World Bank or IMF, and the terms are often opaque. Pakistan borrowed billions for a highway network and power plants. Kenya took out massive loans for a railway from Nairobi to Mombasa. Djibouti built a port. Zambia upgraded its electrical grid. Ecuador built dams. The list goes on. On paper, this sounds like development finance. Help a country build the roads and energy systems it needs to grow. Everyone wins. But the math rarely works out that way. Take that Kenyan railway. It cost about $5 billion. It was supposed to transform trade and pay for itself through freight and ticket revenue. Instead, it's run at a loss nearly every year since it opened. The trains aren't full. The freight projections were wildly optimistic. And now Kenya owes China hundreds of millions in annual debt payments it can barely afford. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port is even starker. The port was built in the middle of nowhere, in the hometown of Sri Lanka's then president. There wasn't enough shipping traffic to justify it. The project hemorrhaged money. Sri Lanka defaulted, and in 2017, they signed over operational control of the port to a Chinese state-owned company for the next century. This pattern repeats across dozens of countries. Big loan, Chinese construction, project underperforms, debt spiral. And yet China keeps writing checks. So here's where it gets interesting. Most people assume this is just bad lending, that China miscalculated, that they expected these countries to repay and got it wrong. But what if the debt was never really the point? Think about what China actually gets when a country can't repay them. They don't get their money back, but they do get leverage, access, influence. Sometimes they get the asset itself. That port in Sri Lanka, it's now controlled by China, and it sits along one of the world's busiest shipping lanes between the Middle East and Asia. Djibouti's port? China built a naval base right next to it. Pakistan's infrastructure projects? They're part of a corridor that gives China land access to the Arabian Sea, bypassing the South China Sea entirely. This isn't finance, it's territorial strategy dressed up as development aid. And here's the uncomfortable part. It's working. When you owe someone money, they have power over you. Not just economically, politically, diplomatically. Countries that owe China billions tend to vote with China at the UN. They stay quiet about Xinjiang, they don't recognize Taiwan, they sign security agreements, grant access to resources, allow Chinese companies to operate with fewer restrictions. Debt becomes influence, and influence becomes alignment. China doesn't need these loans to be profitable in the traditional sense. They need them to be strategic. The return isn't interest, it's a seat at the table, it's ports along trade routes, it's rare earth minerals, it's political cover. It's a slow, patient reconfiguration of who holds power in the developing world. Now, there's a counterargument here, and it's worth taking seriously. China would say they're doing what the West failed to do, actually building infrastructure in places that need it. The World Bank and IMF have been lending to Africa and Asia for decades, often with harsh conditions, and the results have been mixed at best. Meanwhile, China shows up with cranes, concrete, and speed. And that matters. A country like Ethiopia or Laos doesn't just need a loan, it needs a highway, it needs a power plant. China delivers that. There's also the fact that calling every Chinese loan a debt trap oversimplifies things. Not every project fails, not every country is struggling. Some of the infrastructure is genuinely useful, and many of these governments entered these deals voluntarily with their eyes open because they had no better options. But here's the tension. Even if the projects are useful, even if the intentions aren't purely cynical, the structural outcome is the same. China ends up with leverage, the borrowing country ends up dependent, and when things go wrong, China holds the cards. It's not a trap in the sense of trickery, it's a trap in the sense of inevitability. Let's zoom out. What we're watching is a kind of financial imperialism that doesn't require armies or colonies. It requires capital, construction contracts, and time. The United States built its global influence after World War II through military alliances and institutions like the IMF and World Bank. That system is still in place, but it's slow, bureaucratic, and increasingly detached from the needs of developing countries. China saw an opening. They had the money, they had the state-owned companies, and they had a willingness to lend without lecturing countries about democracy or human rights. So they moved fast. And now, from the Pacific Islands to Eastern Europe to Sub-Saharan Africa, Chinese infrastructure is everywhere. Roads that didn't exist 5 years ago, ports that handle a quarter of a country's trade, energy grids that keep the lights on. And all of it comes with strings. Invisible at first, but they tighten. Here's where it gets messy. A lot of these loans are coming due right now. Countries are facing a debt crisis, currency collapses, inflation, political instability. Some are trying to renegotiate, others are defaulting outright. And China's response has been revealing. They're not acting like the IMF, they're not demanding austerity or regime change, but they're also not offering blanket forgiveness. Instead, they're negotiating case by case, extending timelines, restructuring terms, and in some cases converting debt into equity or long-term leases. In other words, they're turning unpayable loans into permanent stakes. It's patient, it's flexible, and it's deeply strategic. So why does China keep lending money to countries that can't repay them? Because repayment was never the goal. The goal is presence. The goal is dependency. The goal is a world where roads, ports, and power lines run through Beijing, where political decisions get quietly filtered through the question, what does China think? It's not a conspiracy, it's just leverage compounded over time. And the uncomfortable truth is that it's working. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough. The West spent decades exporting its political system. China is exporting infrastructure. And in a world where most people care more about electricity and jobs than electoral transparency, infrastructure might just win. The question isn't whether China's strategy is moral or fair. The question is whether anyone has a better alternative. Because right now, they don't. And that empty port in Sri Lanka, it's not a failure. It's a blueprint.